It's 7 o'clock. This is Sky News Tonight, live from Kiev, a special programme on the deepening crisis here in Ukraine. Soldiers on high alert and residents defiant, we report from the front line as Russia is accused of an invasion of eastern Ukraine. Concern, though, that this is just the beginning as Putin blames Ukraine for the crisis and the Russian parliament gives him permission to deploy troops. President Biden is expected to announce US sanctions against Russia when he speaks shortly. We'll bring that to you live. And the UK targets 5 banks and 3 oligarchs, but warns it will go much further if Russia does not pull back.
Putin is implacably determined to go further in subjugating and tormenting Ukraine.
Good evening from Kiev, the capital of a country on high alert tonight amid what the West is calling a Russian invasion. The international community issued its response today in the form of sanctions after Vladimir Putin ramped up tensions by recognizing the independence of 2 rebel-held areas. But there are fears that could be just the beginning after Russia's parliament rubber-stamped Putin's request to send armed forces abroad. It formalises the deployment of what the Russian president called peacekeepers in eastern Ukraine, but could also suggest he intends to launch a broader attack. The contested Donbass region, internationally recognised as part of Ukraine, but with an enclave of Russian separatists. Last night, Vladimir Putin recognised the independence of 2 breakaway republics in Donetsk and Luhansk. The separatists only control about 1/3 of the regions, but with military backing, there's now concern that Russian troops have crossed the border and may push further into Ukraine. Sky correspondent Alex Rossi reports now from Pisky, a village on the line of control between the rebels and Ukraine.
Under sludgy grey skies, they move amidst the wrecked buildings, waiting for an attack they think could come at any moment. The front line is increasingly moody. It's tense with expectation. The soldiers know this conflict is shifting, and they fear the might of Vladimir Putin's army is massing not far away in the areas held by Russian-backed separatists. The Kremlin calls the soldiers a peacekeeping force, but the commander here tells me that is just another deception.
Збройні сили Російської Федерації будуть продовжувати нарощувати свою присутність на території Донецької та Луганської областей, які поки що знаходяться під контролем так званих ЛНР і ДНР. І швидше за все будуть пробувати вторгнутися на територію України для того, щоб повністю захопити по адміністративному кордону Донецьку та Луганську область.
The war has been grinding on for 8 brutal and unforgiving years. This memorial to a Ukrainian mortar unit sits desolate in the shadow of a smashed-up school. Whoa. All along these front lines, there are reminders that death is never far away. And the abandoned buildings tell their own stories of lives changed forever by this conflict. We've just heard the sound of fire in the background. We've come into this school for cover. This has been abandoned in the fighting, all of this town here. We're close to Donetsk airport. Now, the soldiers we're with, they are worried about what has happened with Vladimir Putin's recognition of the breakaway regions. They think that this may really be the eve now of a big invasion into this area by Russian forces. It is hard to convey just how close the villages are to the front lines. This one is regularly hit by artillery, but amazingly, people still live here. They are the old and the infirm. People like 83-year-old Stepanivna, who have nowhere else to go.
Кому мы нужны? Ну куда я поеду, если я тут родилась, крестилась, и дети мои, и все, и куда я поеду? Я уже не боюсь ничего. Прибью, только хорошо, если прибили сразу. И все.
Ukraine is a country under psychological and physical siege. The soldiers here say the sanctions will not be enough to deter further Russian aggression. And they know they may soon have to fight to defend these positions as the Kremlin redraws the map of Eastern Europe. Alex Rossi, Sky News, near Donetsk.
So the White House has described Russia's actions as an invasion of Ukraine, paving the way then for US sanctions. President Biden is expected to hold a news conference at the White House shortly, and of course we will bring that to you. Let's go live to the White House and our correspondent Mark Stone. So Mark, we've heard today from the UK government, we've heard from the EU. What are we expecting from Joe Biden?
Well, the hope all along is that if they had to impose sanctions, then Western nations would be able to impose a package or individual packages of sanctions which looked identical and which could be imposed at the same time. In doing that, they would be able to send a clear, united message to Vladimir Putin. That is not looking like it is going to be possible. The EU is taking a little time to ratify the sanctions package that they want to put through. The British sanction package is being criticised already in the UK for not being strong enough. And the expectation, although we may find out more when we will find out more when President Biden speaks, but the expectation is that what he will announce will not be the full and unprecedented sanctions that have been talked about for so many weeks. And I guess the reason for that is simple. It's because they need to keep something up their sleeve. They cannot roll out a full package now, because what happens if Vladimir Putin ignores that again? They've got nothing left, because they've said, the Americans have said repeatedly, that military action within Ukraine is simply not a possibility, because Russia is, of course, a nuclear power. So I expect we will see something short of the full extra special sanctions, extraordinary sanctions that have been talked about. We're not, I don't think, going to see Russia cut off from the SWIFT banking system, for example. If that was the case, then we would have seen similar in the UK and in the EU as well. But at the same time, President Biden has to show that he means business. He has to show some sense of strength. Ultimately, though, Mark, the sanctions threat, and that's what it was a threat of sanctions, it's failed, because President Putin knew that sanctions of some sort would come, and yet he has ignored them. I think what's interesting is the evolution of language here in Washington over the course of the last 24 hours. They were talking about an incursion, and now they're talking more about an invasion. The Deputy National Security Advisor, who will be giving a briefing later, said, look, an invasion is an invasion, and this is an invasion. But then he added, Russia has been invading Ukraine for about 8 years now. So a sort of caveat there. I think simply they want to be able to hold back some sanctions options. They don't want to be able to have to roll them all out together. A very, very difficult, unenviable situation. And the broader point is that watching President Putin over the course of the past 24 hours, as they have been so closely, they will wonder now if he ever was serious about diplomacy, or whether he might just push on through into the rest of Ukraine at some point anyway.
OK, Mark, thank you very much indeed. Quick look inside the White House. That is a podium that requires an American president. When it gets one, we will bring him to you. Now, in Moscow today, Vladimir Putin rejected claims he had breached the terms of the Minsk peace process, saying the agreement no longer existed because of the actions of Ukraine. And he issued a list of demands to end the crisis, calling for Crimea to be recognised as part of Russia, a halt to weapons shipments to Ukraine, and an end to the country's bid to join NATO. Our Moscow correspondent Diana Magne reports now on the Russian escalation.
Russian flags and honking car horns in the separatist city of Donetsk. But this bestowal of independence, which is not Russia's gift to give, will not necessarily bring peace. Vladimir Putin declaring today he'd recognized the separatists' claims to the whole of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, not just the parts they control.
We have recognized all fundamental documents and their constitution. And constitution determines the borders of Donetsk and Lugansk regions while they were part of Ukraine. But we are counting on resolution of all these differences.
The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, whose territory this is, called for an immediate and tough response from the West.
Europe and the world cannot allow the repetition of the tragic mistakes made in Georgia in 2008. We agreed on the necessity of immediately imposing sanctions for another action of aggression against Ukraine. These sanctions must include the complete shutdown of Nord Stream 2.
And as if on cue, the German Chancellor obliged.
I
have asked the German Economy Ministry today to withdraw the report on the analysis of the energy supply guarantees from the German regulator. It sounds technical, but it's the required procedure so that there can be no certification of the pipeline now. Without this certification, Nord Stream 2 can't become operational.
Russia's upper house has now authorized the deployment of the Russian armed forces in the separatist republics, as and when it's deemed that they're needed. But are they already there? Unmarked military convoys on the roads of the republics last night, though not much to go on beyond these pictures. Declaring the breakaway republics independent is one thing. Pushing further into Ukraine is another. Both are clearly invasions of Ukrainian sovereignty, but one would involve a lot more bloodshed. The question is Vladimir Putin a rational actor, or has he let his emotions and the bubbling resentments of years, if not decades, get the better of him? Again, he returned to an imaginary threat of a one-day nuclear Ukraine.
Ukraine, since Soviet times, had quite an extensive nuclear competences. They've got several nuclear units, and their nuclear industry is well developed. 110 kilometers can be increased to 300 to 500 kilometers, and then Moscow will be within the reach of these rockets. For us, this is a strategic threat.
Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons 30 years ago in exchange for security assurances from the likes of Russia. President Putin first broke those promises 8 years ago in Crimea, and he continues to trample on them now. Diana Magnay, Sky News, Moscow.
Well, Boris Johnson today announced what he called the first barrage of sanctions against allies of Vladimir Putin and Russia's financial institutions. 3 oligarchs and 5 Russian banks were targeted, with measures including UK asset freezes and a ban on British businesses dealing with them. And the Foreign Secretary Liz Truss says the government is prepared to go much further if Russia does not pull back. Our political editor Beth Rigby reports now on the UK response and a warning. It contains flash photography.
Nobody sleeps when Europe's on the brink of war.
Isn't Russia unstoppable now?
The Foreign Secretary arriving before sunrise, an emergency Cobra meeting convened in the early hours, and a promise to punish Putin.
If Vladimir Putin continues down this track of violence, of aggression, of a full-scale invasion, of encircling Kiev itself, which is what he seems to be proposing to do, capturing the Ukrainian capital, it is absolutely vital that that effort, that conquest of another European country should not succeed, and that Putin should fail. And that is what we will be exerting ourselves to ensuring is the outcome.
Will sanctions be enough to stop Putin, Prime Minister?
An attempt to answer that question in the Commons as the PM announced limited sanctions.
Today, the UK is sanctioning the following 5 Russian banks: Rossiya, IS Bank, General Bank, Promsyaz Bank, and the Black Sea Bank. And we are sanctioning 3 very high net worth individuals. This is the first tranche, the first barrage of what we are prepared to do. And we hold further sanctions at readiness.
The Labour leader falls square behind the PM on the principle, but frustrated that strong rhetoric hadn't translated into enough real action.
We must be prepared to go further. If we do not respond with a full set of sanctions now, Putin will once again take away the message that the benefits of aggression outweigh the costs.
The complaint that current measures are not enough, widely shared. It's not doing anything, said one MP. The Prime Minister taking notes as all sides of the House called for heavier, harsher measures.
We need to hit them if we're going to hit them with sanctions hard and hit them now. They need to feel the pain of the first part of this decision. We are facing the growth of the axis of totalitarian states.
My anxiety is that we're not going anywhere near far enough today. That's right. In 2014, we were spineless in the end.
Can I urge the Prime Minister to go further today? President Putin has made a terrible decision. Will the Prime Minister make sure he pays a terrible price?
The Liberal Democrat leader urging the Prime Minister to strip Russia of hosting the Champions League final.
I think it inconceivable that major international football tournaments can take place in Russia after, as I say, the invasion of a sovereign country.
Foreign Secretary, are the sanctions enough? A question being discussed behind this door as the Foreign Secretary was summoned to a second Cobra meeting of the day.
Good afternoon, thank you for what you're doing.
Sanctions in London, British troops to Ukraine's neighbouring borders. This was the PM visiting army personnel in Poland just days ago. And today the government promising more military help if necessary.
We're absolutely open to doing even more if required, because we need to send that clear signal to President Putin, as I have warned and warned the Kremlin for weeks and months, that as we knew in 2014, he gets the opposite of what he wants. He will get more forces on his borders, and just as he did in 2014, he will no doubt get more spending on defence in NATO.
But for all the rhetoric, there was disquiet in this place today over that package of sanctions. Bringing a pea shooter to a gunfight is how one foreign policy expert put it. This is a significant moment in the history of the 21st century. Europe stands on the brink of war, and our leaders simply don't know whether Putin intends to go on or take a step back. But what we do know is that in years to come, they will be judged on how they met the moment and whether in that moment they did enough.
There's an old military maxim which is clout, don't dribble. And the reason you should hit hard early is to make sure you're absolutely clear that any escalation will hurt. There's no point in ratcheting it up. You must make sure that there's an absolute line. And I'm afraid what we've done with the sanctions today is introduce sanctions that the US introduced 4 years ago.
The PM will be considering the UK's next move. This is the end of a very long and dark day and the beginning of what could be a protracted and bloody crisis. Beth Rigby, Sky News, Westminster.
And Beth joins me now from Westminster. Beth, I guess one of the problems is that if sanctions are the only real weapon in this crisis, you've got to keep some key ones back.
Yes, Mark, and that was what Mark in Washington was just talking about, wasn't it, as we wait to see what President Biden has to say. What has been going on here today? Well, as I was reporting, the Prime Minister, and we've seen it in recent days, has been very strong rhetorically in his warnings to President Putin, and also not mincing his words on the gravity of the situation, the risk of bloodshed and the protracted crisis that Europe could now be entering into with the decision by Putin to have that incursion into those separatist territories within Ukraine. But what's happening in the UK government is that there is an appetite, a desire to be in lockstep with other allies, so to go in line with what other Western allies are doing. Why? Because Western allies want to present a united front to Putin. But domestically, for Boris Johnson, that has thrown up problems today. And that's because, and you saw it in the Commons today, across Parliament, across all parties, MPs want him to go harder and faster. There is Russian money in London, and they want to see a ratcheting up of sanctions, and Keir Starmer laid that out in the House. He said that Russia should be excluded from the SWIFT mechanism. We should stop trading Russian debt. He said that the UK should get its house in order and stop the illicit flow of Russian finance into to Britain. And I spoke to a couple of former cabinet ministers about their perspective, and they said, well, they understood that diplomatically Boris Johnson might want to stay in lockstep with our allies, our Western allies, that actually there's more Russian money in London and there's more financial links than in other countries, and they do too want to see a ratcheting up of sanctions in order to say, as one former cabinet minister said to me, well, you put the sanctions on now and then you tell President Putin that you'll roll them back if necessary as this unfolds. So there is huge pressure here to put more sanctions in place. But the Prime Minister clear too that this is just the first round and they are now waiting and watching to see how this unfolds.
OK, Beth, thank you very much indeed. Well, the European Union says it unanimously agreed on the sanctions it's imposed on Russia, targeting banks accused of financing operations in disputed Ukrainian territories.
This package of sanctions that has been approved by unanimity by the member states will hurt Russia, and it will hurt a lot. We agreed to target 27 individuals and entities who are playing a role in undermining or threatening Ukrainian territorial integrity, sovereignty and independence. But sanctions are only part of our response. Diplomatic efforts will continue to avert a new eruption of war, of conflict in the heart of Europe.
Live then to Brussels and our Europe correspondent Adam Parsons. And Adam, it does seem as if the EU have gone, well, certainly further than the UK.
Yeah, it does seem that way. They've introduced a raft of sanctions. They have done by EU standards, done this pretty quickly, targeting 27 individuals and entities. I know that within that are 3 substantial banks. But I think the 2 standouts from this are, number 1 is Nord Stream 2, that pipeline running from Russia to Germany. We know the Germans were reluctant to put that on the table. They did. And then today, rather proactively, that was the first big standout sanction. A second thing that the European Union has done, which I think is very important, is to say that it will restrict Russia's access to Europe's capital markets. Now, that sounds pretty fustery, but actually...
OK, Adam, got to interrupt you. We're going straight to Washington and Joe Biden.
Well, good afternoon. Yesterday, Vladimir Putin recognized 2 regions of Ukraine as independent states. And he bizarrely asserted that these regions are no longer part of Ukraine and their sovereign territory. To put it simply, Russia just announced that it is carving out a big chunk of Ukraine. Last night, Putin authorized Russian forces to deploy into these regions. Today, he asserted that these regions are actually extend deeper than the 2 areas he recognized, claiming large areas currently under the jurisdiction of the Ukrainian government. He's setting up a rationale to take more territory by force, in my view. And if we listened to his speech last night, and many of you did, I know, he's setting up a rationale to go much further. This is the beginning of a Russian invasion of Ukraine, as he indicated and asked permission to be able to do from his Duma. So let's begin to, I'm going to begin to impose sanctions in response far beyond the steps we and our allies and partners implemented in 2014. And if Russia goes further with this invasion, we stand prepared to go further as with sanctions. Who in the Lord's name does Putin think gives him the right to declare new so-called countries on territory that belong to his neighbors? This is a flagrant violation of international law and demands a firm response from the international community. Over the last few months, we've coordinated closely with our NATO allies and partners in Europe and around the world to prepare that response. We've said all along, and I've told Putin to his face more than a month ago, that we would act together. And the moment Russia moved against Ukraine, Russia has now undeniably moved against Ukraine by declaring these independent states. So today, I'm announcing the first tranche of sanctions to impose costs on Russia in response to their actions yesterday. These have been closely coordinated with our allies and partners, and will continue to escalate sanctions if Russia escalates. We're implementing full blocking sanctions on 2 large Russian financial institutions, VEB and their military bank. We're implementing comprehensive sanctions on Russia's sovereign debt. That means we've cut off Russia's government from Western financing. It can no longer raise money from the West and cannot trade in its new debt on our markets or European markets either. Starting tomorrow and continuing in the days ahead, we'll also impose sanctions on Russia's elites and their family members. They share in the corrupt gains of the Kremlin policies and should share in the pain as well. And because of Russia's actions, we've worked with Germany to ensure Nord Stream 2 will not, as I promised, will not move forward. As Russia contemplates its next move, we have our next move prepared as well. Russia will pay an even steeper price if it continues its aggression, including additional sanctions. The United States will continue to provide defensive assistance to Ukraine in the meantime, and will continue to reinforce and reassure our NATO allies. Today, in response to Russia's admission that it will not withdraw its forces from Belarus, I have authorized additional movements of U.S. forces and equipment already stationed in Europe to strengthen our Baltic allies, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Let me be clear, these are totally defensive moves on our part. We have no intention of fighting Russia. We want to send an unmistakable message, though, that the United States, together with our allies, will defend every inch of NATO territory and abide by the commitments we made to NATO. We still believe that Russia is poised to go much further in launching a massive military attack against Ukraine. Hope I'm wrong about that. Hope we're wrong about that. But Russia has only escalated its threat against the rest of Ukrainian territory, including major cities and including the capital city of Kyiv. There are still well over 150,000 Russian troops surrounding Ukraine. And as I said, Russian forces remain positioned in Belarus to attack Ukraine from the north, including warplanes and offensive missile systems. Russia's moved troops closer to Ukraine's border with Russia. Russia's naval vessels are maneuvering in the Black Sea to Ukraine's south, including amphibious assault ships, missile cruisers, and submarines. Russia's moved supplies of blood and medical equipment into position on their border. You don't need blood unless you plan on starting a war. Over the last few days, we've seen much of the playbook that Secretary Blinken laid out last week in the United Nations Security Council come to pass. A major increase in military provocations and false flag events along the line of contact in the Donbass. Dramatically staged, conveniently on-camera meeting of Putin's Security Council to grandstand for the Russian public. And now, political provocation of recognizing sovereign Ukrainian territory as so-called independent republics in clear violation, again, of international law. President Putin has sought authorization from the Russian parliament to use military force outside of Russian territory. And this set the stage for further pretexts of further provocations by Russia to try to justify further military action. None of us should be fooled. None of us will be fooled. There is no justification. Further Russian assault in Ukraine remains a severe threat in the days ahead. And if Russia proceeds, it is Russia and Russia alone that bears the responsibility. As we respond, my administration is using every tool at our disposal to protect American businesses and consumers from rising prices at the pump. As I said last week, defending freedom will have cost for us as well and here at home. We need to be honest about that. But as we do this, I'm going to take robust action to make sure the pain of our sanctions is targeted at the Russian economy, not ours. We're closely monitoring energy supplies for any disruption. We're executing a plan in coordination with major oil-producing consumers and producers toward a collective investment to secure stability in global energy supplies. This will blunt gas prices. I want to limit the pain to the American people are feeling at the gas pump. This is critical to me. In the last few days, I've been in constant contact with European leaders, including with Ukrainian President Zelensky. Vice President Harris met in person with the leaders in Germany over the weekend, at the Munich conference, including President Zelensky. At every step, we have shown the United States and our allies and partners are working in unison, which he hasn't been counting on, Mr. Putin. We're united in our support of Ukraine. We are united in our opposition to Russian aggression. And we're united in our resolve to defend our NATO alliance. And we're united in our understanding of the urgency and seriousness of the threat Russia is making to global peace and stability. Yesterday, the world heard clearly the full extent of Vladimir Putin's twisted rewrite of history, going back more than a century, as he waxed eloquently, noting that, well, I'm not going to go into it, but nothing in Putin's lengthy remarks indicate any interest in pursuing real dialogue on European security in the year 2022. He directly attacked Ukraine's right to exist. He indirectly threatened territory formerly held by Russia, including nations that today are thriving democracies and members of NATO. He explicitly threatened war unless his extreme demands were met. And there's no question that Russia is the aggressor. So we're clear-eyed about the challenges we're facing. Nonetheless, there is still time to avert the worst-case scenario that will bring untold suffering to millions of people if they move as suggested. The United States and our allies and partners remain open to diplomacy if it is serious. When all is said and done, we're going to judge Russia by its actions, not its words. And whatever Russia does next, we're ready to respond with unity, clarity, and conviction. We'll probably have more to say about this as it moves on. I'm hoping diplomacy is still available. Thank you all very much.
Are you still open to meeting with Vladimir?
So Joe Biden there with his announcing his sanctions and not taking questions noticeably at the end of that. What did he have to say? He said that Russia is carving out a chunk of Ukraine and he's setting out a rationale, he said, to go much further than that. Who in the Lord's name thinks Putin has the right to take territory from a neighbouring country? Joe Biden then announced the sanctions, cutting off Russia, he said, from raising money from the West. And he also announced sanctions on the Russian elite and their family members. He said if he goes further, we will go further. Let's speak to our White House, go to the White House rather, speak to our US correspondent Mark Stone. And Mark, noticeable at the end, he said, still time to avert the worst case scenario. We're ready to talk.
Yeah, you know, I mean, it is admirable from his perspective that they are keeping the door or the window wide open for dialogue, for diplomacy. They are taking the moral high ground in that sense. They are saying, as he did again, that any troops that are deployed to the region, and he did point out that more Americans would be buttressing, to use the phrase they've used before, the eastern flank. All those troops are defensive in nature. He's really pushing the point that the aggressor here is not the West. It never has been, so he says, and it never will be. The aggressor is Putin. I think tomorrow morning's headlines have probably already been written by that line. Who in the Lord's name does Putin think he is? Gives Putin the right to do this. In terms of the detail of the sanctions, exactly as we expected, not the full tranche or the full package of sanctions that had been suggested, because it isn't a full invasion. This is the first tranche of US sanctions, and many, many more could be put in place, so the president said. Simply, they have to keep some sanctions up their sleeve. They can't impose them all now. That's the rationale that they are using. They are using them as a deterrent. Of course, they're well aware that the deterrent has not worked so far, because President Putin has indeed tried or attempted to annex another part of Ukraine. He is putting forces within Ukraine's territorial borders, and yet the threat of sanctions were there, and President Putin has ignored them. But this is one tranche, and I think it is significant that he's naming a specific bank that he says will be sanctioned, the VEB bank and its military branch. This is a major bank in Russia. and it has the ability to do trading with banks in the United States. Well, that will cease. That has ceased as of now. And he talked too about Russian individuals that will be sanctioned, and we'll get the names of those, I'm sure, in the detail that will come out in the coming hours. So a first tranche of sanctions. The objective is to try and appear united with the UK, with the EU and with other Western nations. It's difficult, though, because they all have their different types of sanctions. They all come out at slightly different times. The objective is to appear united.
Mark Stone at the White House, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's just get the thoughts now of our panel this evening as the West responds to what Joe Biden calls an attack on Ukraine's right to exist. I'm joined by Sir Roderick Lyne, former UK ambassador to Russia, Kay Bailey Hutchison, who's a former US ambassador to NATO, and also senior advisor at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. And also the economist Anders Aslund, who's a senior fellow at the Stockholm Free World Forum and who knows plenty about sanctions. Thank you all for being with us. And Sir Roderick, if I could, I think, start with you and the question everybody wants an answer to tonight. What is President Putin up to, do you think?
Well, it was interesting that President Biden picked up on Putin's statement yesterday. Nobody in Moscow ever knows what's in Putin's mind, but his statement yesterday was rambling, it was paranoid, it sounded at times almost unhinged. And as your Moscow correspondent rightly said just now, there is a question as to whether Putin is a rational actor. What he's just done is to re-invade about 3% of Ukraine's territory and rather absurdly recognize it as independent. Nobody else will follow him in that. What he has still left completely unclear is what his next move will be. And there will be a number of factors in that. I think he will take note of the united Western position. I think if he's being rational, he will think very hard about the effects within Russia. I don't think the Russian population want to see Russians killing Ukrainians. He'll think about the economic damage, and he ought to think about what China is going to say, because China supported him in opposing the expansion of NATO, but China has not supported him in the idea of taking Ukraine. And a strong message from China could also be part of the deterrent to President Putin.
Yeah, some very interesting points there. Kay Bailey Hutchison, just on one of the points made, do you think that President Putin is a rational actor? And how far do you think he is going to go in this?
I don't think he is rational, but I also don't think that we can measure him because our standards are so different from his. We think that having the respect of the world is important. He doesn't. We think that human rights are important. He doesn't. So I think we have to try not to get in his shoes because we can't, our culture doesn't understand it, that taking over another sovereign nation is absolutely against everything that we stand for. And that's what he's doing. And he has been very clear that Ukraine is not another country, that it is a Soviet satellite. And so I think we have to act with strength and commitment. I thought the president's point that we are coordinating with allies was very good. I think your government has already put in sanctions, so has the EU. Now we have announced ours. And I hope that those sanctions against the banks and also that we would put trade embargoes on Russia and what they could deliver out to any of our countries will be important to see if this makes enough of a difference in his economy and his revenue stream that it will deter him to going back to the diplomatic table. Just staying in the Donbass is not enough. He has now invaded that country. He's disrupted all of those regions that he is now saying are in his domain. And he has also made an agreement with them that he will be putting military bases in those two provinces. This is what he did in Georgia. We could look at that playbook.
Yeah. Now, Anders Asland, are these the right sanctions that we've been hearing about today? Are they the right sanctions at the right time?
I would say that these are the right sanctions, and it's very good that they're coming immediately, which is the right time. And the two banks or financial institutions that are being sanctioned are quite important. VEB could be described as President Putin's slush fund, what he uses for unexpected undertakings as financial crisis or the Sochi Olympics were financed out of that. Tromsø's bank is specialized on the military industry. So neither of these banks deal with the Russian people. So that's the first one today. But more should come, as President Biden suggested. It's also good to take, to completely sanction Russian sovereign debt. And it's excellent that Nord Stream 2 finally gets a sanction. And it's also good that it's done together with Germany so that it is being stopped. It remains to be seen who in the elite that are sanctioned. So far, we have seen that the most important people have normally not been sanctioned, and I'm waiting with a great interest to see the actual name that I presume will come out later today or tomorrow.
Yeah, we're still waiting for those names. Sir Roderick, back to you. And I don't know whether you saw it, this bizarre, extraordinary Security Council meeting that President Putin had yesterday and chose to have on live television. It led me to wonder whether he has people around him that can talk sense to him. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, it was absolutely wacky. And I think you've touched on a real problem. When Putin first came into power, lots of people went through his office and he listened to a lot of people. He's now hiding away from the Russian people. He's existing in a little bubble and surrounded by aging people of his own generation, many of them ex-KGB or ex-military, steeped in Soviet traditions, who are not challenging him. There are people, many people in the Russian elite who are deeply unhappy with the policy he's pursuing. They include some Russian generals who can do the maths and can see that this would be a very ill-conceived operation. They can see another important thing that Biden said was that he was going to put further American forces into the Baltic states. Putin has provoked the reinforcement of NATO's eastern flanks. That's exactly the opposite of what the Russian General Staff would have wanted to see. But I don't think that Putin is listening to serious advice. He has the total power over decisions of war and peace, and I think that's quite a dangerous situation.
Kay, how concerned are you that if Putin gets Ukraine, then that seriously redraws the map vis-a-vis Russia and NATO?
Such a good question, and so important that we keep that in mind, because this boldness that Putin is showing is because he's gotten by with Georgia and Crimea. And now he is doing the exact same thing that he has done before. And if we don't show the strength to push back and be stronger than we were because we were so surprised in the first two, then I think he is going to be emboldened to go further, possibly into the Baltics or Poland, possibly from Belarus into Kiev. And it is so important that we stand firm right now. And I do think that what Germany has done has to be complimented and called out, that they have now finally said, we're not going to do Nord Stream 2 unless we see a complete retreat from what he has done right today. That is probably the biggest incentive of all, because it is a revenue stream that Putin needs for all of his malign activity.
Do you think, Kay, that NATO could do enough to deter Putin?
Well, I certainly think that we are sending the signals, and President Biden mentioned the Black Sea, and that is something that we haven't talked about very much, but the patrols in the Black Sea also are escalating, and the countries that are in NATO there, like Romania, like Bulgaria, and Turkey, all then have to be looking also at the Black Sea. So now that we see that he has taken this step with Ukraine, we have to assume that that nothing is off the table for him, and we have to act accordingly with strength and commitment. And that's what NATO is doing right now by increasing our troops in the Baltics. We've already done so in Poland, and now we are going to be watching the Black Sea very carefully.
And Anders, just back to sanctions, it's often said that sanctions don't really impact President Putin. It's said that, you know, now that his economy can withstand whatever sanctions the West impose. Is that true?
No, it's not true. Russia has not had any economic growth from 2014 to 2020, when Central and Eastern Europe by and large grew by 45% a year. So Russia has suffered massively from the financial sanctions in particular. And it's another part of your question, and that is, will it deter President Putin? No, because Putin doesn't care about the economy or the population. This has not impressed him at all. He put out a plan 1.5 years ago for the next 10 years, predicting no economic growth at all. There are no attempts to reform the economy or to modernize the economy. It's all about defense and repression. So Putin has really turned into a complete tyrant. In the first 2 terms, he provided high economic growth, or rather he was lucky because he arrived at the late table after the hard reforms in the 1990s, and then came the oil boom. But after 2009, Russia has hardly had any growth, and real disposable income, the standard of living, fell by 11% during the last 7 years. So Putin doesn't care about that. In 2008, the stock market fell by 80% from May to October. Was President Putin impressed? Not the least. In 2014, after the Western sanctions had been imposed and after the war in eastern Ukraine had started, the value of the Russian ruble fell by more than half. So what? Putin was not impressed. So it's rather that President Putin gets less of economic resources for his defense. Russia spends about 6% of its gross domestic product on defense, and it can hardly spend more than that. And that is the limitation, not what happens to the economy and what happens to the population.
Okay, just a minute or so left. I just want to ask Sir Roderick and Kay in particular where they think this is heading. So, Sir Roderick, I mean, look, I know how difficult it is to predict these things, but what is your hunch about how this may play out?
Well, the position that Putin is in at the moment doesn't really make any kind of sense. Either he's got to go further, and he could go down towards the Black Sea, or he could go to Kiev, or he's got to seek to take some winnings by stopping where he is and trying to negotiate. And it's anybody's guess as to what he does. But it's important for him to remember there are a lot of very, very unhappy people in Russia, and he's taking a big risk which could rebound against him personally.
And just so quickly, Sir Roderick, do you think there's a possibility that he could sort of leave it where he is and say, look, I mean, he had his big speech, obviously. He had the big Security Council meeting in public. I mean, is it possible he may want a way out now and just decide,
yes, it is possible.
This is it?
You had General David Petraeus on a bit earlier, who was also pointing out it is absolutely possible. Putin could declare a victory. He said, I've now recognized the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. I've put the West on the defensive. He would then seek perhaps some further gains if he can. He has that option. He hasn't foreclosed that option yet. But whether he will take it or not, as I say, you're all guessing at what's inside Putin's head, and nobody knows that. Possibly Putin doesn't know that.
No. OK, well, just 30 seconds left. And Kay, Bailey-Hutchison, I mean, do you think there's a possibility of a negotiated settlement here, or do you fear he is going to push on and do what he wants to do with Ukraine?
Well, I think I agree with what was said before. I think he would negotiate, but I don't think, and I think he may well have just wanted to get those two and hold them just like he's done in Georgia and solidify those gains. But he is not going to ever be able to negotiate that this will be part of Russia. That will not be accepted, just like Crimea is not being accepted as Russian. It is Ukraine. And like the two provinces in Georgia are still Georgia, even though the Russians now require teaching of Russian in the schools. They have border patrols and border controls on the two provinces that they have illegally taken. I think they could well say this is a victory. All I really wanted was the two provinces and walk away, but never will they be able to get the Ukrainians and President Zelensky to say, okay, we'll make a deal, you can have them. The people do not want that in Ukraine. They are fierce for Crimea, and they don't want to give up eastern part of their country. And they are wonderful people who are so committed to a free and open and fair treatment country for Ukraine.
OK, Kay Bailey-Hutchison and Anders Asland, and also Sir Roderick Lyne. Thank you all very much indeed. Now, despite placing sanctions on two Russian banks and targeting the Russian elite, Joe Biden says that he hopes diplomacy is still available. But speaking this afternoon, Vladimir Putin rejected claims he was to blame for the crisis, and he issued a list of demands calling for Crimea to be recognized as part of Russia, a halt to weapons shipments to Ukraine, and an end to the country's bid to join NATO. Well, let's get some reflection on the last 24 hours now. Our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, is also here in Kiev, and reflection on 24 hours, the last 24 hours, Deborah, but also looking ahead. These are dangerous hours and dangerous days.
Yes, it's hard to imagine that at the beginning of yesterday, people were talking about the possible hope of a diplomatic breakthrough thanks to the French president's telephone efforts over the weekend, trying to conjure up some kind of summit, perhaps, between Joe Biden and President Vladimir Putin. But since then, the day ended, didn't it, with the Russian president recognising the independence of those two separatist-held territories and saying that he'll be sending Russian so-called peacekeepers into those territories in a significant escalation of a crisis that British and American leaders have warned could lead to an all-out invasion of Ukraine. But to offer a different perspective, I went and met the Estonian president today. He actually flew into Kiev, especially in a show of solidarity with the Ukrainian president and Prime Minister who he met, wanting them to know that he believes that the door to NATO and the EU must never be closed to countries like Ukraine. We can have a listen to a bit of that interview.
How worried are you that what we're seeing in the East is the beginning of the invasion? So it's already started.
It is a beginning of an invasion, but we hope it will also end there. So this was also my main message, because we started and we will start with the sanctions, US, UK, as well as European Union. And I hope this will stop this kind of escalation, and Putin will start thinking what he has done and what might happen in future.
In the US and the UK have been very open in the fact they do believe that there will be a full-scale invasion. So do you disagree with that?
I talked to Ukrainian Prime Minister and also to President. They don't think this would happen. Probably they have their own information sources. So what I can say is we hope it won't happen. So let's see.
And do you think, though, that if President Putin is successful in taking control, at least, of Ukraine, that he could then turn his eyes wider and maybe look at the Baltic states?
As I said, if he tries to look wider, he's looking at NATO. And it's not the Baltic states, Estonia or any other country, it's NATO. And that's a different story, as I said.
And I guess the UK embassy's moved. Why haven't you moved your embassy from Kiev?
Because from my opinion is that ambassadors and embassies should stay on the front line in these kind of situations.
So a little dig there at the British and the Americans that have left their embassies here in Kiev, but very much united front by the Europeans and the US in this escalating crisis.
Deborah, thank you very much indeed. While we were on air, Joe Biden announced sanctions against Russia. This is Sky News Tonight. Coming up in the next hour, the West responds with sanctions, saying the Russian invasion of Ukraine has begun. Much more at the top of the hour.